I'm going to show you the trajectory of great power war over the last 500 years. These are the wars involving the largest states and empires around in a given era, the ones that can project military force beyond their own borders. And the wars that they get involved with account for a majority of all deaths from all wars combined. And they're the least likely to have been missed by historians of the era. The first graph shows from 1500 to 2000 the proportion of years that the great powers fought each other. And it shows that several hundred years ago, the great powers pretty much always fought each other. That's just what great powers did. More recently, the great powers have rarely, if ever, fought each other. Here we have the duration of wars involving a great power, showing another decline. There used to be things like the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War. The 20th century had the Six-Day War. Here we have the frequency of wars involving a great power, also showing a decline over the last 500 years. However, one trend went in the opposite direction for most of this period. Namely, once a great power did start a war, how many people was it able to kill per country per year? And here we see that for 450 years, great powers got better and better at killing people more and more quickly, thanks to advances in military technology and organization. But after World War II, that curve did a U-turn, and we're now living in an era in which the frequency and duration and deadliness of wars are all going down simultaneously. This is what you see when you multiply those three figures together and simply look at the number of battle deaths. You have a zigzaggy curve, but one whose lowest point in 500 years corresponds to the last portion of the 20th century. We can now zoom in on the last 100 years where the historical records get more detailed and plot the rate of deaths in all wars combined. And it shows that in the 20th century, there indeed were two big spikes of bloodshed centered on the two world wars, but that rather than being a harbinger of the future, there was something closer to a last gasp. And in the decades since, the rate of death in war has gone lower and lower. This is the period that has been called the Long Peace. The fact that since 1946, there's been a historically unprecedented decline in interstate war, that is, wars between two countries. The most interesting statistic of this era is 0. There were no wars between the United States and the Soviet Union, contrary to every expert prediction that World War III was inevitable. No nuclear weapon has been used since Nagasaki, again, contradicting every expert prediction that World War III would be a nuclear war. There have been no wars between great powers since the end of the Korean War in 1953. No wars between Western European countries, a fact that almost seems banal and unexceptional and boring. Like, who would ever expect, say, France and Germany to fight a war? But needless to say, this unthinkability of war between France and Germany is a very recent historical development. Prior to 1945, Western European countries started 2 new wars a year for 600 years, a number that after 1945 fell to 0. And there have been no wars between developed countries. The 40 countries with the highest GDP per capita have not fought each other since 1945. Once again, at first it sounds like a boring observation. We think of war as something that takes place in poor, backward corners of the earth. But for most of human history, it was the big, rich states that were constantly at each other's throats. And because they could afford big, destructive armies, they could do a lot of damage. Well, what about the rest of the world? In a process that I call the New Peace, the Long Peace seems to be spreading to the rest of the world. Now, though there have been fewer interstate wars since 1946, there was an increase starting in the 1960s in the number of civil wars and the number of internationalized civil wars, where some country butts in on one side of a civil war. This happened as newly independent states with inept governments tried to defend themselves against insurgent movements, with both sides armed, financed, and egged on by the Cold War superpowers. But with the end of the Cold War, the number of civil wars declined too. Ultimately, though, the key question is which wars kill more people? The old-fashioned interstate wars that have been in decline, or the newer civil wars that showed an increase in the post-war years before they decreased? And this graph shows the answer. First, I've plotted for each decade since the 1950s the deadliness of interstate wars, which shows a massive decline, the deadliness of internationalized civil wars and purely internal civil wars doesn't come close to making up for the amount of damage done by interstate wars. If we now combine these statistics, how many wars took place with how much damage each war does, we get a stacked layer graph that looks as follows. Here we have the rate of death for colonial wars, which tapered off to 0 by the 1970s. The rate of death in interstate wars, with a government on each side, which shows a number of spikes corresponding to Korea, Vietnam, and Iran, Iraq, but nonetheless shows a marked downward trend. And the number of deaths in civil wars and internationalized civil wars, though also bumpy and uneven, shows an unmistakable decline. Here we are in the 21st century with a thin laminate of layers showing that the rate of death in warfare now, though not 0, is lower than it has ever been. What were the immediate causes of the long peace and the new peace? Well, Immanuel Kant threw out 3 hypotheses a couple of hundred years ago in his essay Perpetual Peace, in which he proposed that democracy, trade, and an international community all disincentivized leaders from waging war. More recently, the political scientists Bruce Russett and John O'Neill have tested Kant's hypothesis in a large data set of militarized disputes and found that he got it right 3 out of 3 times. All 3 of these variables increased in the second half of the 20th century, and all of them are statistical predictors of peace, holding all other factors constant. Finally, there are the rights revolutions, the targeting of violence on smaller scales directed against vulnerable sectors of the population, such as African Americans and other racial minorities, women, children, homosexuals, and animals. The civil rights revolution put an end to the practice of lynching, which used to take place at a rate of about 150 a year at the turn of the 20th century. By the 1950s, that had been brought down to 0. Hate crimes against blacks have been in decline since they were first measured in the 1990s. And this favoring of minorities has been a worldwide phenomenon. This graph, it's not confined by any means to the United States. Just as one index, this graph shows the number of countries that have discriminatory or apartheid laws on their books. The blue line shows the number of countries that bend over backwards in the other direction and have laws that favor their disadvantaged minorities. For the last few years, there have been more countries that have tried to bring their disadvantaged minorities up than that have actively discriminated against them. The women's rights movement has seen an 80% decline in the rate of rape, a similarly precipitous decline in the rate of domestic violence, a decline seen even more dramatically in the most extreme form of domestic violence of all, namely uxoricide, the murder of female partners, and mariticide, the murder of male partners. The graph shows that in fact the decline has been even steeper for male victims than female victims, showing that the women's movement has been very, very good for husbands. The children's rights movement has seen a decline in the practice of corporal punishment in schools, strapping or paddling. This graph shows the percentage of American states that still permit it. Approval of spanking or smacking has gone down in opinion polls in every Western country. And at least in the United States, rates of child abuse, both physical and sexual, have been in decline, as have rates of violence on playgrounds and other non-lethal crimes against children. The animal rights movement has seen a decline in hunting, an increase in vegetarianism, and a steep decline in the number of motion pictures in which animals were harmed.